It has been a very exciting third day of PILF 2022. Welcome back. One of our most awaited session today, Cloud Money by Dipankar Mukherjee in conversation with Brett Scott, will begin now. Dipankar Mukherjee, a management graduate from IIT Madras, Dipankar had worked for the consulting industry for almost 8 years before taking the road less traveled to pursue his passion for reading and writing. His major assignments were with IBM and Ernst& Young. You can contact him through LinkedIn or Facebook. Brett Scott. Brett Scott is a journalist, monetary anthropologist, and former financial broker who explores the intersections between money systems, finance, and digital technology. In 2013, he published The Heretic's Guide to Global Finance, Hacking the Future of Money, a guide to high finance and the emergent forms of alternative finance, alternative currencies, and activism that are challenging it. He has spoken at hundreds of events across the globe and has appeared across international media, including BBC World News and Sky News. He has written extensively on financial activism and reform, digital finance, blockchain technology, and the cashless society for publications like The Guardian, New Scientist, Huffington Post, Wired Magazine, and CNN.com, and publishes the Altered States of Monetary Consciousness newsletter. He did a degree in anthropology in South Africa and a master's in international development at Cambridge University, UK, and is a senior fellow of the Finance Innovation Lab UK and an associate at the Global Prize. I now request Dipankar Mukherjee to begin the conversation.
Thank you, Renu. It's a pleasure to be at PILF 2022 and great to be in conversation with you, Brett. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. I'm here in Berlin. It's very, very cold. But yeah, great to join you.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure for us at PILF to be able to have this conversation with you. And let's begin and let's not wait anymore. So, my first question to you, Brett, is that after your first book, what gave you the idea of doing your second, and especially calling it Cloud Money?
Sure, yeah. Well, my first book, which Reno was mentioning, was the Heretic's Guide to Global Finance, which came out in 2013, and the Heretic's Guide was basically a guide to the financial system for anybody who was concerned about the power of finance. And of course, in the wake of the global financial crisis in 2008, that was a big topic. People were interested in how do you challenge the power of the financial system and so on. So the book was about that. And I was looking at also at alternative forms of finance. So, different styles of finance. And around that same time, actually, there was the fintech sector. So financial technology companies were coming to prominence around 2013, 2014, when that first book came out. And many of these fintech companies liked to see themselves, or had a kind of a self-image perception, that they were also challenging the financial sector, that they were also a type of alternative finance. All right. So they imagined that this is what they were doing. Whereas, I was based in London at this time, where the fintech sector is very, very big. And it became very apparent to me that what the fintech sector was often doing was, rather than challenging big finance, it was often just sort of automating the existing financial system. All right. And this idea that just the simple act of automating the financial system is the same thing as reforming it was quite problematic. So I started to explore this intersection between technology and finance, and how, in fact, actually many big tech firms are increasingly kind of fusing together with big finance firms rather than challenging each other. They're kind of like fusing, should we say. And in this context, there's a particular thing happening in the monetary system, which is physical cash is increasingly being demonized. All right. Now there's a story out in the public about why this is the case, saying, hey, people are naturally moving away from cash and so on. But when you zoom out and you look at these big processes in the global economy, and you say, what's actually often happening is you can see that the cash system, which is, offline physical units of money that people can pass between themselves, in a way stands in the way of this kind of fusion between big tech and big finance, because you can't automate the cash system. All right. It requires human beings that sort of, at a ground level to be interacting with each other. And so the anti-cash ideology, in a way, is emerging from these corporate players. All right. And this is what I started to realize. And I started to realize that the way that cashless society was being reported on was very, very uncritical. It was often just the way that journalists would talk about it. They would just say, oh, well, ordinary people just naturally want to move away from the cash system. That's why this is happening. There's no top-down pushes against the cash system from the big players. And I found that very unconvincing. And I started to explore that and write about that. And of course, in 2016 in India, there's a very blatant example of a top-down push against the cash system. But, in the UK, where I was based, this has been going on for a long time. All sorts of attacks on the cash system that was slowly eroding the public's confidence or perception of cash, slowly demonizing it. And so I decided to write Cloud Money as a way to explore that and to sort of show those processes and to show the other side of the story about why there's this digitization going on in the monetary system. And the term cloud money, to answer your question, I didn't answer about cloud money, was basically to talk about digital money, to say, we have this term, the cloud, which is actually a very criticized term in technology activism circles, because sometimes when you say the cloud, it makes you think some kind of ephemeral, floaty thing, right? But of course, what we're talking about, when we talk about the cloud in the internet sense, is these huge, corporate data center systems, right? That are processing vast amounts of information from people. And of course, cloud money is talking about, the corporate digital money systems which are run by the banking sector and big tech, essentially. And you're moving to cloud money, you're moving to these huge systems where all your interactions have to go through these massive kind of IT systems. Oh, you're muted.
I think I'm unmuted. I'm sorry. Yeah. So in your experience in the research that you've done, before I jump into the next question on the book, do you think there is some kind of a ulterior motive or a conspiracy theory for taking cash out of the system, physical cash out of the system?
I wouldn't call it a conspiracy. I would call it, bear in mind what I'm doing. I come from an economic anthropology background. I've worked in the financial sector, but also I'm often interested in the kind of cultural and human processes that are going on in systems, how people influence each other, how mimetic processes spread. And economic anthropology is often quite critical of mainstream economics. Bear in mind, in mainstream economics, the way that the economy is often spoken about, they'll speak about consumers. There's a sort of this idea that what drives an economy are these sort of the everyday person, in a market making rational decisions. All right. But when you go into the anthropology of economic interactions, you realize that everybody is caught in these huge webs with each other, and they all influence each other. And actually, these very, very big players, such as big corporate conglomerates, for example, can have an outsized impact on affecting the culture in an economic system, right? So, in many ways, what happens in these in large-scale capitalist systems, that you can have these oligopolies of big companies that can actually affect how everybody else thinks, all right, and can have outsized amounts of market power in that situation. So you don't need a conspiracy theory to describe how these top-down players affect our perceptions. Actually, it's just what big corporates do. All right. So Visa, for example, which is one of the biggest digital money players in the world. Visa has, in their marketing department, they have a constant attack on the cash system. All right. They're constantly pushing out anti-cash propaganda, essentially. Of course, to a Visa executive, this is just marketing. They're just like, well, we're a company. We lose money if people use cash, right? We make more money when people use our systems. Okay, push out anti-cash propaganda on our marketing systems. This is what we do as a company. It's not like a coordinated conspiracy. It's just what profit optimizing corporations do. All right. And when they all kind of do it at the same time, they create this whole kind of like atmosphere and vibe, right? And actually, this ends up often influencing politicians too. So, for example, in my home country in South Africa, local South African politicians are actually relatively powerless in the global system. All right. So Visa and MasterCard and Apple and all these big players have far more global power than my local politicians in South Africa do. So what a lot of the local politicians will end up doing is to sort of like, actually repeat the same mantras that come out of those big corporate sectors. So I'll have South African politicians who say, it's very, very important that we move towards digitizing everything and automating everything. And they kind of like think that it's coming from their own volition. But in reality, that story has been put in place over many decades by big corporate players, right? So they're actually almost like channeling that. And so this is often what's happening in the global system is, and I think, it takes quite a while to sort of see those processes, but I'm always looking at that kind of stuff. But what the result is that right now in the world, no matter what country you go to, there's an overarching ideology across all countries, which is the idea that what progress means is ever more digitization, automation, scale, and speed. All right? Almost every single politician in the world right now will say that, right? Regardless of what people in the world actually want or what makes them happy. This is the sort of prevailing ideology. And within that, in the monetary system, this ends up being an attack on the cash system, saying it's old, it's inefficient, it's dangerous, it slows things down. This is why it must be destroyed.
Okay, that's an interesting point of view. Would you, so if we categorize countries in their size and maturity of economy, would you say that for advanced economies or the Western economies, having a more digitized format of money is far more amenable as compared to the emerging economies? Is there a dichotomy in that as well? And
Wait,
what happens if a far more amenable or digital money being far more amenable for an advanced economy as compared to an emerging one?
Yeah.
And what happens if an emerging economy like India speeds up the process of adopting digital money?
Yeah. So it's very important. I mean, so Cloud Money, my book, is looking at a kind of across the world type of stuff, of a situation. But of course, there's massive variations depending on what country you're in. So that point I just made about politicians everywhere in the world having a common message, now that's true, right? No matter where I go, all politicians will feel like they have to talk about digital transformation, regardless of whether their country is actually in a position to do that or not. Okay, and that message has largely been created in the Western world, right? In Silicon Valley and all these places. That's where that story comes from. Okay, but that doesn't mean that that can be actually equally implemented around the world. All right, so in many, many countries, it's de facto the case that the informal economy remains very, very important, very, very crucial. All right, but when I'm, for example, in like London or Sweden or these places, there basically isn't an informal economy left, right? There is no such thing as informal economy in Sweden. Everything goes through institutions, all right? Everything goes through some kind of third-party player, okay? Now, that's what, in a sense, is the kind of, the sort of dream, as it were, of many of the kind of like modernizers in the world, is that every human interaction has to go via some kind of formal institution. And of course, if you're in a country like South Africa, where I'm from, and imagine you're like living in a very informal economy, very heavily cash-based, it's very human in a way. It's very like peer-to-peer. All the interactions happen between you and your mates, and you're phoning each other. And you'll understand this in India, right? Everything's quite like horizontal. Now, it is possible that in that situation, you might say, actually, it would be better if we had a more formalized economy. Okay, so I totally understand that around the world there's differences in economies and people are trying to get a different balance. But overall in the world, the overarching move is towards ever more formalization, ever more of these institutions that hover over you when you're doing interactions, right? And in a sense, that's partly what I'm critiquing, and part of what cloud money is actually doing. I'm not arguing that everybody should be using cash all the time. I'm arguing for a balance of power in the system, right? And one of the core metaphors that I use, and sorry, this answer is going on for a long time. I'll end soon. One of the core metaphors I use about cash is to say cash is the bicycle of payments, right? Whereas the digital systems we're seeing are quite like the Uber of payments, or the various, these automated taxi apps. Now, it's quite possible that you might like those automated taxi apps, but that doesn't mean you'd want your entire system controlled by that, right? So in a way, if you're looking at a transport system, you maintain a balance of power between these different types of players. And in the monetary system, it's similar. You've got to maintain a balance of power between these different types of money.
So about a lot of choice. So as a consumer, as a customer, I'd like to have the choice of whether I want to use cash or digital money in my own hand, and not being dictated to that you better use this or that. So
Yeah.
yes, very well. The balance is very important. If not, if a balance goes away, then the biggest threat that we see seems to be of financial terrorism, where systems can be hacked. You will have issues in in myriad forms impacting financial systems. So how does one look at that when comparing digital money versus physical money?
Yeah,
Is that a consideration?
and bear in mind, one of the main reasons I argue for a balance of power is, and this applies to any system, is that when you have different types of coexisting systems, they actually prevent each other from becoming too toxic. All right. This is why if one's not working, you move to another one, right? This is what balance of power is about.
More like monopolistic situation. One gets very huge
So
monopoly.
let's quickly return to my metaphor I was using about cash being the bicycle of payments and these digital apps being like the Uber of payments. All right. Now imagine you're living in in the transport metaphor, you're living in a place that only has bicycles. All right. It may be the case that actually in that situation, it would be very positive to introduce this new form to actually curtail some of the negatives that come from only having bicycles. But the alternative scenario where you only can move using an Uber app would be terrible, right? Because basically you'd have huge resilience problems. If the system goes down, the entire transport system collapses. You'd have huge surveillance problems. Everybody's transport can be watched all the time. You'd have a huge centralization of power in a particular corporate player. And you'd have huge exclusion problems. All sorts of people wouldn't be able to use it. All right. And there's a similar thing with the digital money system. When you totally move to the digital systems, it creates huge resilience problems. All right. The digital systems are very unresilient, and they go down and your entire economy just suddenly collapses. Right. And this happens increasingly in places that are digitizing their monetary systems. You also have censorship and surveillance problems. So people being watched, the ability for an authoritarian state, for example, to watch your payments in order to be able to exert forms of social control. You also have exclusion problems. This idea that many people actually can't access those systems or don't want to access those systems. All right. And that becomes a huge problem. And then you'll have this issue around excessive concentration of power into particular corporate players. All right. And at a global scale, essentially big tech and big finance become the only way that you can interact. Now, I haven't been to India, so I don't actually know that the sort of lived experience on the streets. But for example, if I go to London right now, which has become very heavily digitized over the last couple of years, I basically cannot interact with somebody else economically unless I ask Visa and MasterCard to do it for me. All right. I literally cannot survive in that society unless I'm going through these institutions. And that's very much like the situation where I can't travel unless I call an Uber. All right. And this is the sort of the way to think about this issue, is that the negative sides of digital systems really come out when there's no alternative. All right. So the cash system provides this important counterpower.
So on that, since you mentioned the balance of power factor, what would you say about program money? So would you think that digital money has a big negative about digital money is that in future it could be used or misused to kill privacy for users? And if so, how does the world see it right now?
Yeah, sure. Now, bear in mind, in a modern market economy, you can't survive unless you exchange with other people. All right. And unless you're living in a sort of semi-subsistence situation, which some people in the world still, are, you can actually still survive without using markets. But for most people in, the world, you literally can't survive unless you're doing monetary exchange. Okay. So the ability to control payments in that situation becomes a very, very powerful political tool. All right. To say, I know that you have to use the monetary system to survive. And if you have to go through some institution to use the monetary system, we can form sort of, watch what you're doing and form potential conditions upon your exchange to say, you can exchange for this, but not for that. You can exchange up to this amount, but not that amount. And this is the programmable money idea, this idea that, the intermediaries in a large-scale monetary system can start to place conditions on how you can interact economically with other people. All right. We've already seen those types of things being pioneered in sort of various forms of automated or digital welfare systems, where welfare recipients, for example, in Australia, will be prevented from buying certain things. All right, by these digital money systems, and these systems can be pioneered, and they're if you're seeing it in China, you're seeing in various places like this, these pilot programs, which are all about placing conditions upon what you can spend money on, right? And of course, in a hypothetical scenario, when you're in a cashless society, that becomes a very, very powerful means to exert forms of top-down control. Okay, so that's really the programmable money discussion. Right now, in most countries, you don't have this happening, but it's a technical possibility that's being explored by many players, and many sort of central bankers put a kind of positive spin on this, but it could have very, very negative connotations or very, very negative effects.
Especially when we see a lot of the world powers moving towards a system which is far more conservative, probably far right, and would want to exert more control on their population. So yes,
Yeah,
that's
absolutely. The rise of authoritarianism.
Yep. So let's come to the idea of crypto and Bitcoin. So how do you see the whole idea of crypto, Bitcoin, in the last few years of turmoil in the market, linking up to digital money?
Yeah, look, there is a strong connection, and I have 2 chapters in my book which cover the crypto world. I'm very careful, though, to place crypto in context, in political context. All right. And it's important to understand the political context, because basically in the 1990s, there were internet activists or digital activists who were looking ahead in time and saying, if we end up in a cashless society, in other words, a society where you can't economically interact unless you go through these big central institutions, if we end up in that society, we're going to have huge problems of surveillance, control, resilience, all these issues that I mentioned. All right. And people that in the 90s started to experiment with how you would design a so-called digital cash, which would act as a kind of digital counterpower to that mainstream type of digital money. All right. And the various experiments that took place in the 1990s culminated in the Bitcoin system, which emerged in 2008, 2009, and got developed over the following years. And so it's important to understand that Bitcoin does come out of a political impulse that says it's a problem that we'll have a cashless society. But having said that, the reality of what Bitcoin's ended up being is very, very different to what its original sort of maybe political background is. All right. The reality is what Bitcoin's ended up becoming is a kind of tradable, collectible digital object within the normal monetary system. So the vast majority of people who use things like Bitcoin are actually buying it with normal money and then reselling it for money. So it's essentially treated as a kind of speculative asset. It's not really treated as a monetary system at all. Although many of the core Bitcoin community still goes through this rhetoric, this idea that what Bitcoin actually is a challenge to the monetary system. All right. And there are certain money-like elements to the Bitcoin system, but in reality, it's a kind of swappable, speculative digital object, which is very, very volatile. So for the vast majority of, let's say, small businesses or ordinary people, it's incredibly hard to actually use an incredibly volatile thing as a monetary system, right? Because bear in mind, the Bitcoin system goes through these crashes where it sort of loses 40% of its monetary price in one day and then bounces back up. And imagine you're a shop owner trying to deal with your nervous system is going to be totally shot by this if you're actually trying to manage a business. All right. So for most people, that the crypto system doesn't actually form an alternative. But that said, it's created a lot of hype. It's created a huge industry around it, a huge gambling industry, essentially. And it's also, in a way, has become a kind of what's the word? A place where people project their visions of some kind of alternative. All right, a kind of like so in some ways, it's created some interesting things, but it hasn't done what it's claimed it's going to do.
So, Brett, I strongly feel that Bitcoin and crypto has actually confused the audience on digital money a lot. As a matter of fact, when I look at these three elements, digital money, digital currency, and the crypto world, somewhere because of the overemphasis on crypto and the speculative nature of crypto, the entire and all three of them have been kind of mixed up. What is your view, and how is the world dealing with that?
Yeah, it's a huge problem. So every time I get asked to, often when I'm in interviews on media and stuff, you'll have a journalist and they say, oh, okay, so your book is about cash versus cryptocurrency. I'm like, no, my book is about the actual monetary system, which is about, government issued cash versus the banking sector controlled digital money system. All right. Which is what the actual cashless society debate is about. All right. Then there's a sideshow, which is the crypto assets, which are essentially objects within the normal system, much like anything you can trade in the normal system. The main difference is that these speculative assets market themselves as being digital money, which means they're constantly confusing people all the time. So the debate is really about like crypto versus cash somehow. And of course, one of the big bonuses for the actual digital payments industry is it distracts people. All right. For example, in London, where I have a lot of experience, right now, HSBC, the big banks like HSBC, Barclays, Santander, and big card companies like Visa and MasterCard are de facto taking over the entire monetary system. And yet, if you go into a London pub, what are people talking about? Bitcoin, and this is the real thing, right? Of course, for HSBC and all these huge players who are taking control, this is great because people are distracted. They're not actually looking at what's really happening in the monetary system, which is that the banking sector and big tech are taking over. Okay, so in many ways, the crypto world has become this very like problematic distraction for people. And I can sort of understand it politically why people push all their hopes and dreams and their sort of speculative impulses into it. But it absolutely, it's because it's a huge problem. And also currently in this debate around so-called central bank digital currencies, which is this new type of potential money that's going to be issued, it's also sort of really disorientating people about that debate, which we can go into if you want me to.
There's one more point that you mentioned about digital currency. Now you already have wallets, okay? Digital wallets are there, and drones of them are there. Now you talk about digital currency as well, which are nothing but digitized form of real cash. So you will have a, let's say, an Indian format, a 10 rupee digital value or 20 rupee digital value, equivalent of that to be traded. How does one, as in a consumer, get to deal with this entire information overload, and what is good and bad? How does one decide that?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's important. I mean, look, public understanding of monetary systems in general is very low. And I don't mean that to be an insult, it's just a reality. Most people in the world don't have very good training on monetary systems, and the economics discipline doesn't really help very much because often the economics discipline just doesn't have a very good idea about the monetary systems. Often just sort of takes it for granted. And so, one of the biggest things is to help people try to understand the structure of monetary systems so that they can understand the politics. All right. And in some ways, there's a few different, this is quite a complex area, but in some ways, the way that I would be looking at it is that a monetary system, if a person's thinking, often people imagine that a national currency is a single system, right? But in reality, it has all these different players involved. Okay, so there's the state that will issue physical cash, all right? But then there's the banking sector that'll issue a second layer of money on top of that. Okay, and one of the metaphors that I use to explain this to people is to think about casinos. All right, if I go to a casino and I hand over cash to a casino, they issue out chips to me, casino chips. And a casino chip is a privately issued form of money that's connected back to the cash, right? But it's a secondary system. And the digital systems that we use right now, all right, if you're using an app or cards and stuff, those are a digital casino chips, right? A sort of second layer of money. But then there's these third layer systems, all right? So if you're using these kind of, systems like Paytm and stuff like that, or these like PayPal, there are these third layer systems that are built on top of the second layer system, all right? And in each of these layers, you've got these different issuers, and they can actually issue in physical or digital form, all right? So the main, in traditional monetary systems, the main two types of money is state-issued physical money versus bank-issued digital money, all right? And the new type of debate coming out now is whether the state should also be issuing a type of digital money that we can use, all right, which would have a huge disruptive effect. So a lot of the current debates are about that. I'm not sure if I'm fully answering your question, but the important thing to realize when you're analyzing it is the different layers of the monetary system and the different issues involved in that. You're muted.
I think to a large extent, as and when the national currencies get issued in digital format, a lot of these wallets may get rationalized. However, technically, do you believe that this digital currency is going to be additional to the money supply in the market of M1 and M2, or is it going to be a part of it converted into digital? How does that work out?
Wait, sorry, say that again?
So when a central bank is issuing cash or is printing currency, there's a finite amount which we call a money supply, right? So when digital currency conversion happens, are the banks going to convert a part of this money in circulation, or are they going to issue a brand new kitty altogether?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but so the current money supply in any country that you're in will be a combination of the different types of money that are issued out, right? So, for example, in the United Kingdom, in the UK, about 5% of the money supply is in the form of state-issued cash, right? 95% of the money supply in the UK is in the form of bank-issued digital casino chips, as it were. That's sort of second type of money, right? 95% of the UK money supply is like that. In poorer countries, that balance is often different. Often they'll have a higher amount of state-issued money than the bank, because the banking sector isn't as well developed. But in very advanced industrial economies, often the banking sector dominates the issuance of money, right? And depending on particular situations, right? And Yeah, so I mean that's the situation right now. What's called the money supply is made up of these different types of money from different players, and in traditional economics jargon, you'll have M0, M1, M2, which are these attempts to measure the different types of like layers of money. But the best way to think about it is like, you know, the cash versus the digital casino chips that people are using in the digital system, right? That's what we're basically talking about with these money supply figures. And so, for example, if the if the central bank starts to decide that it's going to issue a new type of digital currency rather than just cash, that's going to affect that. I'm not sure if I'm fully understanding your question, or maybe I'm bypassing it somehow.
I think that's what I was asking for about M0, M1, and M2, and I think more or less I understand what you're trying to say over here. What I also now want to understand, Brett, is you mentioned about the gap between a fintech company and a finance company reducing over time. Okay, so when the technology and the finance industry are fusing, is that a good, bad, ugly? What is your opinion?
Well, again, bear in mind, I don't really see the world in goods and bads necessarily. You know, I see contradictions, you know, like kind of yin and yang kind of things, right? It's like there's just different things that emerge. And one of the reasons why I argue for balance of power in systems is that you're wanting to sort of balance off the goods and bads in systems, right? So I don't have a essential problem with a fintech company, all right? What I have a problem with is, say, the domination of an economy purely by digital players, all right? Because what the fintech industry on net has ended up doing is helping big tech companies fuse with big finance companies, all right? Because bear in mind, in our older economies, you would have the banking sector is relatively discrete. It has its boundaries, and then you have these other big firms that will kind of like be competing and stuff like that. But what's increasingly happening with the sort of rise of the sort of Silicon Valley models is that these big players like Amazon, for example, Amazon literally can't survive as a global entity unless it's plugged into these huge global finance fintech systems, right? Now, you might find that convenient, but that's a transfer of power to very, very large corporations, all right? So part of the question is, do you want to allow for that full transfer of power, or do you want to maintain some kind of balance of power again, right? So this is largely what the kind of debate is about. I think your microphone might be scratching or something. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So and this is what I'm trying to get people to sort of think about. I'm not being like, fintech is terrible and we should never have fintech and everybody should be using, cash in a cash economy. I'm asking people to think critically about the consequences of fully switching to fully digital systems, right? And that's partly, and to look at the sort of real world politics of that, right? Because we have these very euphemistic stories. The sort of dominant story in the public domain is that, the reason this all happens is that ordinary people just want ever more convenience and speed and da-da-da-da-da-da, all right? And in reality, it's got very, very little to do with what you personally want. It's got to do with what corporations, like how they optimize profit. Amazon ain't going to optimize profit if you're using cash, all right? Cash to an entity like Amazon is like a nightmare, all right? It's like human beings on the ground interacting with each other rather than going via my data centers. What is that? It's like you can't make profit off that as an Amazon entity, which is why that story like seeps down eventually into the public domain. All right. And so I'm trying to push this counterpower idea out so we can maintain these sort of like alternative ways of thinking.
So, you mentioned the word data. Okay, data has a huge impact in our current hyper-connected finance world. Okay, what's your opinion of what all can go wrong with data if we fully switch on to the model of digital money?
Sure. I mean, there's in my book, I speak about three different, let's call them big Bs. Okay, there's Big Brother. Big Brother is the sort of typical one people think about when they're thinking about privacy and data. So kind of like an authoritarian, bully, kind of like, that's sort of watching you and trying to control you. Okay, that's one area of concern. All right, sort of big brother type systems. But then there's two others. There is a big bouncer systems. All right, so I'm thinking about a bouncer, the person who stands at a door and says, "You don't get to come in. You do get to come in." That's the sort of person who blocks access. And many companies use data for these kind of big bouncer purposes, to say you get access, you don't. You can come through, you don't get through, right? So a lot of the credit scoring systems, a lot of these kind of fraud detection systems have these like big ways of crunching data to try and work out if you should get access to systems or not. And that may or may not be positive, but the overarching thing that we would be careful with big bouncer systems is that if you get excluded from those systems, and if those systems are shared across vast digital systems in a society, you can block all sorts of people out of the economy with these type of big bouncer systems. Then there's a third type of player, which is the big butler. Okay, I'm thinking about the metaphor of a kind of a creepy butler who sort of stands behind you and says, you shouldn't look at that. Look at this rather. Let me help you. I will help you do these things, right? And this is the kind of the firms that use your data in order to steer you and to sort of curate what you see and to sort of manipulate you in various ways, all right? So this is the sort of third use of your data. So there's data for control, like kind of authoritarian control. Then there's data to decide upon access or not. And then there's data to sort of manipulate how and steer you down particular paths, all right? And all three of those are very concerning. And when you combine those three types of data together, they can get very, very dystopian, There are these two famous books. Aldous Huxley's, what's the name of Aldous Huxley's book? There's George Orwell's 1984, which is all about the Big Brother system. And then there's Huxley's Brave New World, which is all about this kind of world that seems like you have all this stuff, but actually you're being controlled, right? And in many ways, these what's happening in our systems is a kind of a fusion between those types of things, right? We're seeing these Big Brother systems being combined with these manipulative systems to push you down particular paths, all right? And that's, I'm talking quite abstract terms here, but these are the kind of big things to be looking for when you're looking at how data is used.
And that's a reality we're already in. Probably, we may partially be into that world already. For example, Facebook would not show you anything that you don't probably, or anything that they don't want you to see,
Yeah.
So,
exactly.
For example, if I'm trying to look at something to buy online, the next 3-4 days, all I'm going to see is ads for that product.
Yeah.
So
And one of the
controlling what we see.
One of the illusions that's happening increasingly in the digital world is people think they're on public sites. It's like, oh, I'm on a public website. And really you're not. All your data has preceded you, and that they've curated actually a private bubble, which looks like it's public. All right. So there's a whole breakdown of the public sphere, which is a big concern generally in digital politics, which is the artificial appearance that you're in a public space, when in reality you're in a kind of like sort of blinkered bubble, all right? And that's an issue more generally in this politics. And bear in mind, the cloud money is about cash versus digital money, but this is very much linked up to a much broader process, which is about this kind of full digitization, kind of surveillance capitalism, right? So it's linked to all these other kind of issues like that.
So before I end the session, I have a last question for you, Brett. While you did mention that you are proposing a balance between the two systems, digital and physical, but what in your view is going to be the future in reality? Will there be a balance, or will it be more hinged towards digital?
I think we're actually going to see a return of cash, personally. And again, I'm very aware that there's differences in different countries, right? So I'm sensitive to the fact that in different countries there's different situations and people are imagining different things. But overarching across the world, I think there's actually going to be a breakdown in the idea that digital everything is the future. We've been living under that idea for quite a few decades now, this idea that progress is just ever more digitization. I think that narrative probably only has 10 more years. All right. It's going to start to break down, especially in an era of climate change, where you start to see increasing weather events that disrupt infrastructures, right? Bear in mind, these digital systems rely upon vast infrastructures that are quite vulnerable, all right? We also are seeing increasing cyber attacks and geopolitical instability, which actually digital systems become huge bottlenecks for that, right? You have your digital payment system attacked. It can be a massive vector by which a foreign, like an aggressor attacks a country, right? But also, so in this sense, you probably start to see a lot of interest in like how do you again not be totally dependent upon those digital systems. But also, I think among many people, there's increasing digital burnout, especially among young people. Young people are always spoken about as being like the digital future. But around teenagers and people like that, there's huge mental health crises, huge problems of actual digital overload. And I think that almost like the human body, there's only a certain amount of endless digitization that can take place before people just start to say, I'm actually feeling sick by this. I actually feel like it's too much, all right? And I think you could start to see cultural movements that say, there's nothing wrong with slowing something down. Why do we always have to accelerate? Why do we always have to automate, right? We are human beings. We are biological and we like to hang out, This idea that somehow we should be like plugged into a vast metaverse is a bit like alien, really. And I think you could actually start to see that cultural movement starting to emerge in the last 10 years. So in closing, I would say, actually, I don't think it's at all inevitable that the cash system goes into oblivion. You could quite possibly see a return to the kind of like analog and a kind of pushback.
Great. I think that was a wonderful session, Brett, and I really enjoyed discussing the nuances of the system with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Renu, over to you.
We are so happy, Brett, that we got a glimpse into your inspiring journey. Thank you, Brett Scott and Dipankar Mukherjee, for this intriguing discussion and, of course, for being PILF guests. Our next session begins in 15 minutes, that is at 8 p.m. It is Discover Yourself by Andrea Raiku and Rina Pereira. We thank our title sponsors, Vishwakarma Publications, Silver Partner, State Bank of India, Bronze Partner, Bajaj Allianz, and our bookstore partner, Crossword. So see you in 15 minutes.